Welcome back to OpenLine, talking about banning corporal punishment. That's paddling for students with disabilities. We were streaming this show for the first part of the show on our Facebook page on NewsChannel 5 Plus. A lot of comments. William Norris said, I can understand banning it on disabled students as I have a disabled and a non-disabled student. But if my non-disabled child gets out of line, give them the paddle, just like I got as a child. There are a lot of people here that are talking about, I was paddled as a child, go ahead and paddle. And so I think there are also a lot of people who are surprised paddling is even allowed. And so it brings up this interesting debate. Again, you're not trying to ban paddling. You're just saying for disabled kids, no.
Exactly. And I think, again, you know, one of the things when we started looking at this legislation and we started talking to different members of the Education Committee about how they looked at this particular situation and how they looked at corporal punishment for students with disabilities, what was still very important to them was protecting that parent right to make the choice, and to still say that parents know how to discipline their child, parents have the knowledge of what works and what doesn't work, and they wanted to be able to protect that. And so that was one of those key amendments that was in the legislation that I think has allowed it to move forward, is making sure that parents do still have that option, because as you are seeing several people respond, several people, you know, several of us grew up with corporal punishment, with being paddled either by our parents or at school. And so for those individuals, it's not a foreign concept. And if they believe that it works and if it's something that they're comfortable with, then that option would still be there for their son or daughter. Let's go to Patty. Hello, Patty.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
What constitutes a need to paddle a disabled child? What exactly would a child have to be doing that would require a teacher to paddle them?
So the different policies that I've read does not specify an act for a student with a disability versus a student without a disability. What it does do is say that they have to have tried less I guess intrusive methods of behavior, of trying to get that student to behave appropriately before that they would go to corporal punishment. And it was typically, what I read in the report was that it would be defiance was one of the big ones. It would be physical altercations with other students. Those were two of the top reasons that they would resort to using corporal punishment on a student with or without a disability.
Does that answer your question, Patty?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And as someone who works with disabled students, when you hear that, that raises a concern with you, right?
It does, because for students with disabilities, and again, that's broad, very broad, so it is, and specific to the legislation is students with IEPs or 504 plans, which again is most students with disabilities, but not every student that goes to school with a disability has an IEP or a 504 plan, so it does limit it to that particular population. But for many of those students, the behavior is part of their disability. And if you think about somebody with autism who might be really sensitive to noise or to something like that, and their response to a noisy classroom might be jumping out of their seat, flipping over their desk, and then running around the room and destroying things. That's inappropriate behavior, but it's directly related to their disability, and because something is going on with their sensory overload that they don't know how else to process it. And so paddling a student like that would have no impact whatsoever, and it would probably make the situation worse. And so you look at a situation like that. The other thing is that for a lot of students with disabilities, that behavior is a form of communication. They may grab you to try to and drag you in a direction because they don't have any other way to communicate. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody take me by the arm, and it might be a little harder than I want, and they physically drag me to try to show me something. Or they might, you know, start hitting me or doing something like that because they don't know how else to communicate. And so paddling a student for something like that, to me, again, would not have any impact. And even if that student did something to another student, a lot of times it is not what I would call willful misbehavior or willful misconduct. It is an inability to communicate, or it's an inability to truly get their needs across in any other way. And so our role as educators or as support staff is to help them learn how to communicate in a way that's more effective so that they don't have those inappropriate behaviors.
Well, let's go to Michael. Hello, Michael.
Hello.
Go right ahead. What's on your mind?
Well, maybe I've misunderstood something. I have a ban for corporal punishment on disabled children. I thought the state of Tennessee had already banned corporal punishment unless a parent opted in to allow it.
So no, that's not correct. So yeah, again, I think that is a surprise for a lot of people that it's even legal in Tennessee. And then I asked at the top of the show how many counties allow it, and it's the majority of counties allow it.
Well, it's weird. I've always heard by corporal punishment up here in Sumner County, you had to opt in to allow your child to be punished. But I agree with banning for disabled children all the way.
Right.
Well, and sir, in Sumner County, corporal punishment is not allowed. So in your particular county, that would be true, that you would have to actually do some sort of opt-in if they even give that as an option. But according to the list that I have here, Sumner County does ban corporal punishment.
So yeah, it is a county by county thing. You said at the top of the show, 148 districts, fewer than 105, but more than 100 allow them. Mm-hmm. And so it is the majority, but again, we're talking the bigger, the cities don't. Davidson County Metro does not, Murfreesboro City does not, but Rutherford County does, mm-hmm. apparently. So you can look and see, apparently Sumner does not.
Correct. But
all over East Tennessee, it's allowed. And you've brought this bill. Has anyone said, no, what are educators saying? I guess it's interesting, the parental component is very important to lawmakers. Mm-hmm. What about educators? Where are they coming down?
Educators have been, for the most part, fairly quiet on this particular topic. I mean, when we worked on restraint and isolation legislation a few years ago, we had much more teacher engagement than we have with this particular piece of legislation. So there has not been a teacher component of testimony in any of the committees, and the Department of Education has been neutral on the bill, so they don't support it, they don't oppose it, they're just neutral. And so we have not really heard a whole lot of feedback from teachers, and my sense is if there was strong opposition, it would not have moved as quickly as mm-hmm. it did through, just based on past experience, it would not have moved as quickly as it did through the different committees.
Because they wouldn't necessarily have to comment publicly, they could just call one of these lawmakers.
Correct, or email.
Right. Let's go to Mary. Hello, Mary.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
Yes. I don't agree with corporal punishment in any shape, form, or fashion. But my concern is they are putting severely autistic children, disabled children, developmentally delayed children in regular ed classrooms when the teacher is not trained on how to productively teach these children. That is a grave concern of mine going on in education right now.
All right, I appreciate that call. What about, this is a difficult issue. Mm-hmm. They're integrating disabled students into the main population. There's some concerns about that. It's obviously helpful to the student, but there are concerns about it. So here you have a caller concerned. What about that?
And I absolutely agree with her concern. I think that some schools do it very well. Some schools provide the special education teacher as that support for the general education teacher, and other schools don't. And I hate to say that a lot of times it comes down to money, but it does come down to money. Tennessee does not have one of the more robust education systems in the country in terms of funding. And so while the Department of Education, I think, really promotes some very lofty and some wonderful goals, and they are trying to provide training, that trickle down is hard, and when the rubber meets the road, there's not always the money to implement everything that they would like to see implemented. And as somebody who did work for many years primarily with young adults, transition age adults, and then adults, we had a significant amount of training in our side of the world, so not in the school, but in adult services, on how to work with more challenging behaviors, and it makes a huge difference. I can't imagine not having training, and then as a teacher having all of the responsibilities for all of your students, trying to manage a classroom, trying to help a student with autism, for example, that may need to be prompted every 5 minutes, that they're going to have to make a change, you know, that the class will end in 55 minutes and the class will end in 50 minutes, or that they need specific assistance, or that they need to make sure that their iPad's working a certain way. And that is a challenge, and I do think that general education teachers need more support, and I think that there's that push to get more support. A lot of times it comes down to funding. How
do you define more support? Would it be another teacher in the classrooms that maybe just focuses on that one student, or are you talking about more training?
I think it's a combination of both. I think training helps. Most general education students or general education teachers may have one class on special education when they get their degree. That's not enough to work with students with significant disabilities. So additional training would be very helpful. And then also what I would call crisis management training, but helping to understand more challenging behaviors with individuals so that you can sort of keep some of those things from escalating. But the other side of it is that best practice a lot of times is team teaching, where you have a special education teacher in the classroom with a general education teacher, because they benefit not only the few students with more significant disabilities, but they have that additional training that can sort of help students of all levels learn, you know, different ways to learn. And so, but having two teachers in a classroom, again, a lot of times comes to a funding issue.
Yeah, that's going to be very expensive.
Yes, and so sometimes they will provide a one-on-one, a paraprofessional or something like that with a particular student, but again, that paraprofessional may not have the level of education that a teacher does to teach. And so they may be able to keep the behaviors down, but they might not necessarily be benefiting that student in terms of helping them learn.
And what about a parent if they are concerned that disabled student is disrupting the class and hurting learning for others? What do you say to people that have that concern?
So a lot of times you can request that that there be a paraprofessional with that individual, and that's an IEP decision as to what is best for that person. There are still resource classrooms. There are other options where a student can get pulled out to get additional support in the education piece of it. And there is the possibility, depending on what the level of behavior is for the individual, there are behavior specialists that can come in and do a functional behavior analysis for that student to sort of determine what their triggers are, and then put a plan in place that would help manage the behavior in the classroom.
Let's go to Lucy. Hello, Lucy.
Hey.
Lucy, always good to hear from you. What's on your mind?
Well, this is kind of strange to me. I didn't know that you could do this to disabled students. I'm the kid that literally got drug up to the preacher and kicked out of Sunday school at 7 years of age, okay? But I pretty much didn't talk in certain situations until I was almost 17 years old. Sensitive to sound, sensitive to light, sensitive above all to touch. At home, my mother, when it came to punishment, would make us go get a switch. It wasn't the switch to most of the people in my family that bothered them. To me, I almost fainted when I had to go get my switch. I had to be hunted down and brought back with a switch, which I considered was like a log to be switched with a couple of times. That terrorized me, and it didn't bother the other kids. They go right back out and get in trouble. I could not imagine having to receive corporal punishment in school. I heard horror stories. To me, they were horror stories from boys. They could be pretty dramatic about what getting paddled was about. I think if you want your child to have corporal punishment, fine. But if they're disabled, I think the state needs to step in and make it consistent from one end of Tennessee to the other and be the advocate of that disabled child. I just really don't think that they should allow a parent to make a decision to have a stranger, as far as I'm concerned, punish a disabled child. That's just how I feel about it. I agree with you trying to stop this, but as far as other kids that don't have issues, whack the crap out of them. So, that's all I've got to say. Thank you for listening.
Lucy, okay, thank you, Lucy. What do you think about Lucy's call there?
She alludes to something that I find interesting in terms of corporal punishment when she sort of talks about part of it is the anxiety leading up to corporal punishment, and I think I had mentioned on the break I was a product of corporal punishment in the schools that I was in as a child, and it wasn't so much, and I was never on the receiving end of it because I was petrified over being embarrassed in front of other people, and I think that that's a piece of it. And at least in the school I went to, it was never immediate. It was at the end of the day, or, you know, and then they would call out your name, or they would make a production out of it, and that was the piece of it more so than the actual paddling. I think that ended up deterring students in a lot of respects, and I don't have proof of that. That's just my own personal thoughts on it. But if you do take that over to a student with a disability, that's not necessarily going to work either, because they're not going to carry that over. They're not necessarily going to understand all day that they're waiting for this thing to happen to them. And so that's the other reason I think, you know, for trying to work on this particular population, is that some of the other things that go along with the corporal punishment, besides just the paddling piece, have no impact whatsoever.
It's interesting. Yeah, you both mentioned, Lucy and you, yeah, the terror was the waiting, or the going and picking out the switch. That sounds horrible, Lucy. But that's not going to be an impact for a child with a disability. And I guess, is there, this is a big debate, is there any sort of data that would indicate, okay, corporal punishment is super effective, or corporal punishment is very ineffective? Do we see that kind of data?
I haven't personally seen that data, especially with people with disabilities. I can just go on my own, you know, personal experience working with them throughout my lifetime, that for the most part, it's not that effective. And I think, you know, again, it's really hard to determine. And if you look at disability in the broadest sense of the term, and I think that's why they're trying not to be specific as to which type of disability, if it's, you know, and still, again, allowing parents to have that choice, because somebody who has ADHD, or somebody who has, the other thing to remember in Tennessee is that gifted is part of disability, is part of IEPs, you know, special education. You know, whether or not that has any impact. And so I think that that's why the legislature felt so strongly that that parent piece had to be in there to let them decide.
The devil is always in the details. And so if you're going to ban this or that, the question then always becomes, well, how do you define this or that? And so that is an interesting point. You're not necessarily defining disabled. You're not saying a disabled student means X, X, and X. Is that right? It
means somebody who has an IEP or a 504 plan. Right. So whatever the categories are in Tennessee, the 14 categories that fall under that, then those are the students that, and then there's other categories that fall under the 504 plan, but that's a much more students have IEPs than they do 504 plans in Tennessee. That's
a good definition. Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, we'll take a break. If you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.